and those of you who are joining us from other places. Tonight we have a presentation on data, and I think I'm very excited about seeing some of sharing the data being shared. I also want to make a comment that this is an overview. There's a lot more data to come, I believe. Yeah, we'll hear some information from the different groups. And with that, I think I pass on to Assistant Superintendent.
Good evening. I'd like to start by thanking the principals and the supervisors for joining us this evening for the presentation of the 23-24 achievement data. And I'd also like to say that we just enjoyed 2 full days of professional learning with our staffs, and the focus areas were the illustrative math program, unpacking the upcoming units and working on fluency. We also did presentations on safety that are required by the state, and we also worked on curriculum maps at the high school and secondary level, middle school as well.
All right. Then that gets us to the minutes from our meeting on Tuesday, October 8th. Members of the committee, are you okay moving these minutes on for information? Very good. John? Okay, thank you. So the minutes will be moved on to the legislative meeting for information. And that gets us to our presentation. So I think it's going to be a team effort here. So over to you.
Okay, as I alluded to, we're going to give an overview of PSSA, Keystone, AP, and SAT data from last year. The interesting thing about these presentations and these reports is it's sort of a post-mortem report on last year, in that there's not a whole lot you can do to respond directly to this data. But this data is used then to inform future decisions. We can compare it to other years and watch cohorts of kids move through different examinations. But in deciding how to present this tonight, the intention was to show you achievement data that has some disaggregation of groups and programs of students, while also showing you the district as a whole. So you won't see each individual elementary building results, you'll see K-5 elementary scores together. Similarly, when it comes to Keystones, the middle school information will be in with the high school information, and that's intentional because we're trying to tell a K through Keystone story of the experience of our kids and what that looks like from a pretty high level. There is additional data. There are additional parts to our story that the team is starting to work through to look for root causes and to become more strategic in what can be done moving forward. But tonight's intended to be an overview. So we did look at this data through multiple lenses. So you'll see some grade level information. Each content area will be broken out, and then we'll look at subgroups. We did use a subgroup count of 20. So any subgroup that had less than 20 students, that data will not be included. So the N count, if you will, is 20, and that's what it's set to. We will see some overall trends, a focus on just the achievement, as I said. But I think the most important part of the information is probably at the end of the presentation, when we talk about next steps and what's intended to happen, knowing what we know about last year. We're hoping that this presentation becomes something that you can anticipate to see each fall. And it becomes a normal part of our practice to go through this overview together. So it is important also to know that the state has not released comparison data yet, so we don't know how other districts did as of right now. And with that, I think we'll start with telling our story.
So thank you, Ms. Drennan. Thank you to the board. It is an exciting time just to reflect back on the past year and our overall achievement. One of the guiding frameworks that we use to drive not only this work, but much of the work that's already been ongoing throughout the fall is Victoria Bernhardt's Data Analysis for Continuous School Improvement. It's a pretty impactful framework for data analysis for schools, and we hope that many of the principles and philosophies that she speaks to are shown not only tonight but in our work moving forward. The one quote here at the end I think is important, that we understand that data simply tells a story, and it's to inform us of what is working and for whom, what is not working, and then to drive some action steps moving forward. So as much as we can, we try and take a global look and just see how what the data is telling us and let that tell the story for us. Before we get into the actual achievement data, I was really, I thought that part of Bernhardt's work really reflects where we are and the exciting time of where we currently are in Upper Dublin, with our comprehensive planning, with some work around Portrait of a Graduate, other ongoing conversations, new leadership in different places. It's a really exciting time to try and establish who are we, where are we currently, and who do we want to become. And so some of these workflows, some of these questions, some of this framework from Bernhardt really matches not only tonight's achievement data presentation, but also the ongoing work that the entire district and the entire Upper Dublin community is going through currently. So there's some really good concurrent work happening at the same time that we're excited about.
I already spoke to the data that would be included tonight. I just want the people in attendance to be aware that Dr. Ortiz, Mrs. Puste, and I will all be taking turns making the presentation.
Just to lay out the framework, we're going to begin by looking at PSSA achievement by grade, and then we'll begin to transition into content areas, ELA, then math, then science. And we'll end our presentation with PSAT, SAT, and AP score reports. So to begin with PSSA results by grade level, and as we move forward through the presentation, at the beginning of each subsection, you'll see an overview narrative. Hopefully this narrative will streamline some of the objective data that's about to come. So what we can see with grades 3 through 8 PSSA overview, our achievement scores in English and language arts were consistent from grades 3 through 8. There wasn't much variation as we progressed through our school system. Math achievement, though, we did see some changes as students aged. Achievement scores declined as we got older through our system. That trend matches what we saw across the state as well. And our science achievement scores were high both in 4th and in 8th grade, the two tested areas, the two tested grades for the science PSSAs. And as we'll see in a bit more detail in a minute, there do appear to be achievement gaps for different student subgroups that appear near the end of elementary school that then begin to widen as we progress into the older grades. And again, as Ms. Drennan mentioned, some of the subgroups aren't consistently reported simply because of the population size is too small. So in grade 3, our 3rd grade students across the state take both the ELA and math PSSA exam. And we can see that in ELA, and this is a consistent piece throughout 8th grade, we scored at a 77% proficiency rate. 21% of our students scored advanced, 56% of our students scored proficient. That blue and green color indicator on the charts, that's the proficiency levels, and that's what we're certainly shooting for. In math in 3rd grade, there was an 86% achievement rate, and you can see that just over half of our 3rd graders scored advanced on the 3rd grade math PSSA. As we move forward into 4th grade, we can see similar to 3rd grade, an 82% proficiency in ELA. Math, there was a slight decrease to 80% proficiency. And our 4th grade science PSSA scores came in at a 95% proficiency rate, with 70% of our fourth graders scoring advanced. As we progress to fifth grade, ELA stays in the high 70% at 79% proficiency, where math drops to 73% of a proficiency rate there. We will spend a bit more time breaking this out in a more narrowed view as we take a look more at the single subject areas, but I do think it's important to show a chronological progression as our kids age through our system. In sixth grade, as we transition to Sandy Run Middle School, our ELA sixth grade scores came in at a 75% proficiency rate, where math, 69% of our sixth graders scored proficient or advanced in sixth grade mathematics. In seventh grade, that ELA proficiency rate stays consistent at 75%, whereas in mathematics, 57% of our seventh graders scored proficient or advanced. And finally, in eighth grade, we have our science exam return back to our students. But in eighth grade, in the ELA, 78% of our students scored proficient or advanced. 48% of our students in math scored proficient or advanced. And 80% of our eighth graders scored proficient or advanced on the science PSSAs. One thing that's important to note, and we try to provide important context in different pieces throughout here. The eighth grade math PSSA exam, our students also take, many of them, approximately 2/3 of our eighth graders also take the Keystone exam. And so the standards are being taught for two different exams simultaneously in that eighth grade course, which, it's important to live in both worlds. It can also add another layer there for that eighth grade scores as well.
Dr. Ortiz, is it also correct that we have a fairly significant number of seventh graders taking algebra, which means they also are tested in two different areas and the similar curricular conundrum occurs?
Thank you very much. Correct. Approximately 1/3 of our seventh graders are taking the Keystone exam as well. Thank you. So we wanted to briefly provide a chronological look through our achievement data grades 3 through 8. What we'll slow down and spend a bit more time on is some similar data drilled down a bit more and by content area. So we'll start with English and Language Arts. So in a broad overview, our Upper Dublin students are achieving at significantly higher levels than the state over time. And we saw that consistent achievement in the ELA in grades 3 through 8. When we drill down, and you'll see this a bit more in a minute, when we drill down to student subgroups, those who are economically disadvantaged, students with IEPs, and students who are African American achieve proficiency rates at lower rates than their peer groups. Although we did see a bit more growth in those subgroups than in some of their peer groups. The growth data, I think it's important to note, we did not include that in this presentation. It only just very recently, at the end of last week, was released by the state. And so we want to take a deeper look at that, but we've already begun some conversations with our buildings and in different departments around some of that growth data and the metrics that shows. So while we want to keep the focus of the presentation on Upper Dublin students and how we are doing, I think it is important to provide a bit of context into how Upper Dublin is doing compared to the rest of the state or compared to other students in the region. What this chart here shows is in the 2024 testing window from grades 3 through 8, the red line indicates how Upper Dublin students achieved. The blue line indicates how students across the state of Pennsylvania achieved. And what we can see is that across all 6 grade levels, there's approximately a 25% gap between our students achieving in the high 70% proficiency range compared to students across the state of Pennsylvania. Again, we don't want to spend a ton of time on here. We wanted to regardless of how other folks are doing in other places, we want to keep the focus on how our kids are doing here in our schools. But I think it is important to note, just for a little bit of context. Over the past 4 years, you can see that our elementary, this is data that shows how grades 3 through 5 for ELA have achieved. And over the past 4 years, that ELA achievement has maintained a steady 80% proficiency. One note is, and you can see it in the narrative to the right, Upper Dublin students in elementary school scored proficient or advanced at approximately 80% rates over the past 4 years. That 80% proficiency lands us in the 95th percentile for students across Pennsylvania. Right, and so again, we don't want to get into a whole lot of comparisons, but it is important to note where an 80% proficiency lands our students in relation to their peers across the Commonwealth. Before we drill down into different subgroups for elementary English language arts, once again, in grades 3 through 5, we had approximately just shy of 850 students take the ELA exam. 80% of them scored proficient or advanced. If we break it out by grade, we can see a pretty consistent approach there. The one outlier is that in 4th grade, we see 40% of our 4th graders achieving advanced in 4th grade, whereas in 3rd and 5th, they're hovering around 20% there. When we begin to disaggregate elementary ELA scores by race, we do see some trends that appear in other places as well. Again, the proficiency rate for grades 3 through 5 for all students was 80%. But we can see that our African American or Black students' proficiency rates were at 61% in elementary English language arts. Our other racial subgroups achieved at similar rates as their grade level peers. When we break out elementary English language arts by program, right, this is students identified as economically disadvantaged, students who receive special education supports, students who have a 504 plan, students who are multilingual learners. The population count of that subgroup is a small one, which is why we don't see it included here. What we notice, and these are trends in other content areas as well, are students who have a 504 plan that achieve at approximately the same rate as their peers. However, those who are economically disadvantaged and those who receive special education supports achieve at lower rates than their grade level peers. 62% for economically disadvantaged students, 42% for those with IEPs.
So over time, as we're shifting into a 6 through 8 ELA statewide comparison, similar to the slide that you saw for elementary, our students have fared fairly consistently across the years. But if you were to compare us to other schools and students across the state, we continue to be in the top 95 or 97 percentile in the Commonwealth over time.
And so just as we did with elementary ELA, we'll drill down a bit more narrowly here with Sandy Run as well. So Sandy Run students as a whole scored at the 76th. We scored proficient or advanced with 76% of our students. 50% of our students achieved proficiency. 26% achieved an advanced score on the ELA PSSA. Once again, just like in elementary school, we see a fairly consistent achievement score across the grade levels. 75% for 6th grade and 7th grade, 78% proficiency in 8th. When we look at middle school students' ELA PSSA scores by race, the Two outliers here that we see are our Asian students achieved proficiency at higher rates than their grade level peers. Our Black or African American students achieved proficiency at lower rates than their grade level peers. The trends by program are similar in the middle school as they were in elementary school as well, where students who have a 504 plan, their achievement rates are similar to their grade level peers, whereas those who are economically disadvantaged or those that receive special education supports are achieving proficiency at lower rates than their peers. Ms. Tran, do you want to speak to the keystones?
Yes. So now we're going to look at Keystone Achievement. This score includes all test takers in the spring of 24. That means it could be students who completed the trigger course for the Keystone. It could also include a very small number of retesters. So when it comes to Keystone literature, there was 79% of our students who were advanced or proficient. Over the course of looking at the data, it seems that our students are actually achieving better on the nonfiction module than they are on the fiction module. And when it comes to our programs, economically disadvantaged and special education, you can see a significant drop off of where their other peers are achieving. And then when it comes to the disaggregated groups, for our Asian population, similar to what Dr. Ortiz just mentioned, they are achieving at a higher rate than their peers. And the African American and Black population is achieving at a lower rate. In terms of what that looks like over time, we gave you from 2021, which would be post-COVID, on so that you can see a comparison of the scores over time. The 2024 year does appear to be lower than the prior 3 years. When it comes to comparing our Keystone Lit scores to the state, similar to what you saw with PSSA, Upper Dublin continues to achieve at a higher rate and more consistently overall. And this year being a little lower, we are still well above the state performance.
So as we transition into looking at mathematics in grades 3 through 12, we'll provide the same structure as we just did for ELA. So to begin with a global overview, our students are achieving math proficiency at higher rates than their peers across the state. And just as we see reflected in statewide data, Upper Dublin math achievement scores decline as students progress through the school system. However, over the past few years, we have seen achievement increase over recent years. Students who are economically disadvantaged, students with IEPs, or African American students achieve proficiency at lower rates than their peer groups, although, again, their growth scores were strong and promising. And one final overview point to make before we get into the specifics is that achievement and growth on the Keystone exam were lower than the achievement and growth scores on the PSSA exams for grades 3 through 8. As a general overview for that PSSA grades 3 through 8, once again, you can see Upper Dublin scores reflected in the red trend line. And again, grades 3 on the left side, grade 8 on the right. The blue line is how peers across the state performed on grades 3 through 8 math PSSA scores. So once again, we are seeing higher achievement rates than peers across the state, although not where we would like to see our students. These proficiency scores that we see here, just like as we saw in ELA, the proficiency rates for the math PSSA still compare favorably with peers across the state, where though the overall achievement is lower than in some other areas, we're still in the 95th or higher percentile compared to districts across the state of Pennsylvania. Over the past 4 years at elementary school, we see fairly consistent achievement scores in mathematics, grades 3 through 5 from 2021 through this past May of 2024. And so just as we did with ELA, we'll progress through and take a deeper look at how our students did on the Math PSSA exam. So overall proficiency for grades 3 through 5 for 853 students who took the Math PSSA, the overall proficiency score was 79%. As we look at chronologically how did our students do, we can see that in grade 3, 86% of our students achieved proficiency. In grade 4, 80% of our students achieved proficiency. And by grade 5, 73% of our students scored proficient or advanced on the Math PSSA exam. As we break out math achievement data by race in elementary schools, and once again, the overall achievement scores are 79%, excuse me, 79% for all of our elementary school students. We see Black or African American students achieving proficiency at lower rates than their peers, multiracial students achieving proficiency rates slightly higher than their peers. And once again, by program, similar trends is what we saw in ELA. Students with 504 plans are actually achieving at higher rates than their peers, whereas those who are economically disadvantaged or students who have an IEP are achieving at lower rates than their grade level peers. As we move into the middle school years, grades 6 through 8, there's an overall proficiency of 58% on the Math PSSA. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, nearly all of our students are also taking the Keystone exam, the Algebra Keystone exam, in one of their 3 years at the middle school as well. But we see a 58% proficiency rate overall for our middle school students, which is on par or slightly higher than it has been over the past 4 years. As we break it out by grade level, we see a trend that started in 3rd grade continue through 8th grade, where grade 6 students achieve proficiency at higher rates than their 7th grade peers, who achieve proficiency at higher rates than their 8th grade peers. Once again, that trend is reflected in statewide data as well. As we break out Math PSSA data by race, we see our African American students achieving proficiency at lower rates than their peers, our Asian students achieving proficiency at higher rates than their peers. And as we break it out by program, we see all 3 subgroups here achieving proficiency at lower rates than their grade level peers, based on economically disadvantaged students, 504 students, and those who receive special education supports.
In terms of the Keystone Algebra exam, this includes students in grades 7, 8, and 9, as well as a small number of retesters. The overall proficiency was 48.1%. The 2 areas of weakness across the board when it comes to the Algebra Keystone are operations with real numbers and expressions and coordinate geometry. When you look at our Algebra Keystone performance compared to that of the state, similar to our other trends, we continue to be above the state, but certainly not trending in the direction that we would want to see. When it comes to the disaggregation by program, economically disadvantaged and special education, you can see that those populations continue to struggle with this exam. And then the disaggregation by race, consistent with what you're seeing in other areas as well.
And so our third and final tested subject for PSSAs is the science PSSA exam, which, unlike math and ELA, science is only tested in grades 4 and 8. And then there is a biology keystone exam, which for most of our students is taken after their 9th grade biology course at Upper Dublin High School. Proficiency has gradually increased over time. Those students who have IEPs, students who are economically disadvantaged in 8th grade or multiracial in 8th grade, achieve proficiency at lower rates than their peer groups. And a promising trend that we've seen is that all student subgroups met or exceeded the growth standard for all science exams. So as we take a, as we take a closer look at the science PSSA overall achievement, we see that for both 4th and 8th grade students combined, there was an 88% proficiency rate, with 56% of our students achieving advanced scores on the PSSA exam. In grade 4, 95% of our students in 4th grade achieved proficiency, and in grade 8, 80% of our students achieved proficiency. As we can see over time, elementary science has been strong throughout, and in 2024, these were the highest achievement rates that we'd seen in some time. Science PSSA results in grade 8 have gradually and continuously trended upwards, with an 80% achievement rate this past spring on the 8th grade science PSSA exam. In grade 4, as we disaggregate the data by race, and again, we see different student subgroups reflected here because of the population counts. We can see our Asian student population and our white student population both achieving proficiency at over 90%. As we break out grade 4 science PSSA by program, we can see students who are economically disadvantaged achieving slightly lower rates than their peers, students who receive special education supports achieving proficiency at a 75% rate. As we move up to 8th grade, again, there's an 80% overall proficiency for 8th graders on the science PSSA exam. We can see that Asian students in 8th grade performed at higher proficiency rates than their peers. Multi-ethnic students' proficiency rates came in a bit lower than their grade level peers. By program, these trends are consistent with what we've seen in other content areas as well, with economically disadvantaged students and students receiving special education supports achieving proficiency at lower rates than their peers.
When it comes to the biology keystone exam, almost 74% of our students have achieved proficient or advanced. Disaggregated by program, you'll see that both economically disadvantaged and special education students are below that overall total of 73.7%. And as we go through by race, you'll see a significant increase in achievement by the Asian population, students that fall into that category. And again, trends with our Black or African American community, our students are achieving at a lower rate than that of their peers. When you go to the state to district comparison, again, we continue to be well above the rest of the state and trending in an upwards direction, which is encouraging. It's important to know that we are nearing the end of this version of the biology keystone, as well as the science PSSA, and those new exams that align to the STEEL standards will be quickly on the horizon. At that juncture, it will be impossible to make a direct comparison between these achievement points and then ones in the future.
And so we will begin to transition now to some of the high school exams with PSATs, SATs, and AP exams. and using a similar structure as what we did use for PSSAs. So for PSATs, and I'll note in a minute why we took a look at PSATs in a bit more detail than SATs. But the PSATs are administered during the school day in early October, and we had 595 10th and 11th grade students at Upper Dublin High School take the PSATs. That's out of 625 10th and 11th graders there. So 95% of our high schoolers took the PSAT during the school day at no cost to the student. And so one reason that we drilled down a bit more on that is because it's a more universal data point compared to the SATs, where not all students take the SATs, and there are a bit more variables there. But the PSAT data that we'll see came from the fall 2024 administration. And what we'll see is that Upper Dublin students outperform state, national, and global peers on the PSATs, both their overall average and also by subsection. Similarly, Upper Dublin students outperform state, national, and global peers on the SAT as well. And test takers that just graduated, the class of 2024, reached the benchmark, and I'll speak to what that is in a second, on both sub-tests of the SAT. And so it's promising to note that on both the PSAT and SAT, our students are faring very well. One thing that I mentioned in my former roles is we always wish our students achieved at high rates. I hope that your child gets an A in my classroom, but if we're preparing them for the next step that's yet to come, that's an even more promising sign there too, and some of that's reflected here. I know it's a bit tricky to see, but what this chart on the left is showing us is that Upper Dublin students achieved a mean score, an average score of 1041 on the PSAT that was given approximately a month ago. Their peers across the state of Pennsylvania achieved an average score in the 980s. Peers across the country, an average score of 965, and those across the world at 967. So Upper Dublin students performed 5.8% higher than all students in Pennsylvania, and just under 8% higher than students across the country and students across the world on the PSAT this past fall. Similar trends are seen on both the math and the evidence-based reading and writing sections, where the mathematics scores, the average math score on the PSAT was a 513 compared to a 473 average score nationwide on the math PSSA. The evidence-based reading and writing section of the PSAT, our students achieved a 528. Those across the nation achieved a 492. And over the past 3 years, we see promising trends here as well, where there is a gradual increase in our students' average PSAT score. And again, we use PSATs because it is a bit more universal of a data point for all of our students. 95% of our 10th and 11th grade students took the PSAT here in Upper Dublin High School just about a month ago. And briefly, we can take a look at the graduating class of 2024. There were 221 test takers of the SAT. 221 students out of the class of 2024 took the SAT. And there's an average SAT score for that class of 1187. That 1187 is broken down on the chart on the right-hand side, broken out by subtests. The blue chart is our evidence-based reading and writing scores. The blue bar, the orange bar is the average math score. One thing to note here, you can see the dashed white line going across both subtests. This is what the College Board calls benchmark. And you can see that on both subtests, our students achieved a mean score above the College Board benchmark. And what the College Board notes with the benchmark is that if you achieve that benchmark score, there's a 75% chance of earning a C or higher in a college level course in that subject area. a 75% chance of achieving a C or higher in that college level course in that content area. And so we can see that our students, whether regardless of when we're taking the SAT, are prepared for success should they choose to pursue college education after they graduate from Upper Dublin. I'll turn it over to Mrs. Poustet to speak to the AP exams.
Thank you. So just in the same way that we've looked at a summary of our other testing data, we're going to do the same with the AP exam overview. So for the fifth consecutive year, the number of AP students has increased, and you will see that on the subsequent charts that will be coming up on the next slides. The number of exams that our students have taken and the rate of scoring a 3 or higher have also been trending upwards. More than half of the class of 2024 took an AP exam at our high school, and nearly half of the class of 2024 scored a 3 or higher on the AP exam at our high school. So on the next slide, what you see on the left-hand side is you can see the total number of AP students from 2020 to 2024 have increased. So in 2020, we had 317 students who were taking an AP course, and 383 in 2024. The number of exams that our students have taken in 2020, you can see 623, and just last year, that number has grown to 781. And then when we look at how our students are scoring on the AP exam, you know, when you look at a score of 3 or higher, in 2020, we had 294 students who were scoring a 3 or higher, and last year that number rose to 347. So we're seeing growth over the subsequent years with our AP exams. On the right-hand side, you can see the same data just represented in a different way. So you can see the blue line represents the number of AP students, and you can see the orange line represents the number of AP exams, both showing growth in those areas. And then when you look at our students who are scoring 3 or higher, you can see the number of exams. So the number of exams that scored a 3 or higher in that first row, the percentage of total exams in that second row, 3 or higher, and then the number of AP students who have scored a 3 or higher. 89% of all AP exams taken by our high school students resulted in a 3 or higher, which was an excellent achievement for our high school students. As many of us already know, our high school earned the silver recognition on the 2024 AP School Honor Roll. And you can see the different categories that they are looking at in order to receive that distinction. So the first category that they look at is called college culture. That is the percent of students in the graduating class who took an AP exam at any point in high school, and regardless of their score. And we had 52% of the class of 24 who took an AP exam. The next category is college credit. It's the percent of students in the graduating class who scored a 3 or higher on an AP exam in high school, and we had 47% in our graduating class of 24. And then finally, college optimization is that last category. It is the percent of students in the graduating class who took 5 or more AP exams in high school, where at least one of the exam was taken in 9th grade or 10th grade, and we had 14% of our students in the class of 2024. So you can see the different distinctions. We were very close, I think, believing to platinum in some categories, but overall, we are very proud of the distinction of silver for our high school.
And so as we begin to transition and wrap up our portion of the presentation, it's important to know now what, right? I mean, this is hopefully a pretty thorough look at how our students achieved in the year 23-24. But moving forward, there are some action steps that we've already begun or are very excited to begin moving forward. So our school leadership teams, our teaching and learning team, we've collaborated already and have some meetings on the books coming up shortly to take a deeper dive into this data, a more focused view on what standards, as Ms. Drennan mentioned several times, what specific standards, what specific skill areas and topics do we need to pay a bit closer attention to? Are there individual interventions and groupings that we can best support our students to see the growth and achievement that we're all looking for? We also are excited to look at different types of data sets as well. The achievement data is very important, but as we just saw this week in our classroom, in our secondary buildings, climate and culture is very important data set as well to see how are our students doing. Taking a look at perceptual data like belonging and climate. We've, since the beginning of the fall, had conversations at each building about the use of benchmark and diagnostic assessments to best target our students and support them in the most meaningful ways. Moving forward, there are some data sets that we want to take a closer look at than maybe has been the practice in the past around AP potential, PVOS growth predictions, and there's a lot of different ways that we can assess how are we doing and ways that we can best support our teachers and best support our students. And so we're really excited to move forward with some of these pieces. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Drennan to speak a little bit more.
So we're taking a multi-pronged approach to looking at the data sets and figuring out what could be root causes of some of the data that exists, both positive and on the room to grow side. One thing we're taking a look at is making a multi-year professional development plan that will serve to make sure that practices in the classrooms align with the rigor that's necessary so that students can transfer knowledge and do well on these types of exams. We're currently doing walkthroughs. We will have a staff survey so that they can self-reflect on their own skills and be able to guide us, help us in deciding what the next few years look like. But one of the most important things we're doing is in the greater context of looking at an MTSS program, we are about to complete a Tier 1 audit, which means looking at both classroom instructional practices as well as supports for students, what kinds of instructional methodologies are used in the classroom. And from that, I think we're going to learn a lot about what instruction looks like and what we can do to help teachers, to help students. In terms of curricular work, I spoke at the beginning of the meeting about secondary teachers working on curriculum maps. This is really important when it comes to the alignment of standards, and the curriculum should be built around standards that lead to student success on exams like these. So giving teachers an opportunity to look at the rigor of their curriculum maps and what resources they're using so that we can get students across the finish line. Once we have solid curriculum maps in place, we can audit those as well to be able to determine next steps. The other thing that we're doing very frequently is looking at the alignment between regular education and special education. So if you have special needs, where and when do you receive support for those? We are seeking to find ways so that our special education students are continuing to be exposed to rigorous instruction with core instructional materials. And I think over time that should help us shift that population as well. Another task that we're doing under the umbrella of MTSS is looking at screening and intervention tools. We are going through a process this year to identify universal screeners and also figure out ways if students are struggling to help them close gaps. And the last thing we're keeping an eye on is staffing. Are we able to meet the needs of all of our students based on their individual needs with our current staff? Would it mean looking at the way that we staff things a little bit differently? Would we have recommendations moving forward for additional positions? That's also being considered as we move through. Mrs. Puste is going to talk a little bit now about the subject-specific action steps.
So as we look at ELA in particular, Ms. Drennan spoke about this, we are working on our curriculum maps for ELA. Specifically, we're looking at the alignment between regular ed and special ed, and of course our standards alignment. And when we have those, like Ms. Drennan said, when we have those maps completed, when we have those curricular documents done, we then can audit them and see where we need to go. In addition to that, we are continually looking at our writing program and our alignment, especially with our TDA practices, and evaluating how our writing program is working and our TDAs are also working for our students. We spoke to our screening and intervention tools. We are looking at that for ELA, and you'll see it reflected in math as well. One other piece that we started this year is for all of our elementary reading specialists, we started to do what's called LETTERS training. And LETTERS stands for, and I'm gonna, because I always forget what it stands for, but it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. So really working on those foundational reading skills and training our reading specialists that are our experts in our building in the area of literacy, going through phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, vocabulary comprehension, all of those things. So as a team, we've already begun that training together, and we will continue that for the rest of this school year. In addition to that, our teachers who are in grades K through 2 also received what's called the Haggerty Phonemic Awareness Manual. It is a 5 to 10 minutes phonemic awareness activity that they do with their students in addition to the phonics instruction that they're doing, and they have begun to implement that in their classrooms as well. Really working on and focusing on the sound, the letter-sound relationship, blending sounds, putting them together, taking them apart, looking at syllables as well. So it's a great, quick addition to our Foundations Phonics program that we currently have. As we move on to look at math, one of the things that we're continuing our partnership with the University of Delaware. We are continuing the coaching model with them. They were here for the past 2 days working with our elementary teachers in illustrative mathematics the last week. And we are really focusing in the area of math across the board, K to 12, on student-centered classrooms. What does it mean to be a student-centered classroom? What do those practices look like, sound like, and feel like in our classrooms? We have a look for tool that we're using as we go into classrooms and do some of those walkthroughs to look for those student-centered practices. And that kind of brings to the next bullet point, which is the math learning walks. Across all of our buildings, K to 12, we have begun to do math learning walks with our administrators, with our coaches, in various different math classrooms and buildings. And we're using that learning walk tool to really look for those student-centered practices. Of course, we're working on curricular work just like we are in ELA. We're looking at our curriculum mapping, really focusing at the elementary level on illustrative mathematics and that curriculum and how that is going over the course of this year as we implement it. And again, alignment with regular ed and special ed as well. We're looking at the same tools, screening tools and intervention tools for math like we are doing for ELA. And one new addition this year is with Title I funds at Thomas Fitzwater Elementary, we have added a math interventionist. That math interventionist has identified students that are in need of math support to close some of those gaps in the area of math. And this year we're really working on collecting the data and assessing the impact that it's having for students in the area of mathematics, just like we do in the area of literacy and reading with our reading specialists. And then finally, for science, we know that we are moving towards the STEEL standards, which will go into effect next school year. We are working on professional development with those STEEL standards with our science teachers across the board, K through 12, and really focusing on that phenomena-based instruction. Again, we're looking at our standards alignment, we're looking at our curriculum maps and making sure they are in place as we transition to the STEEL standards for next school year. One thing I wanted to point out with PSSA and Keystone, just so that we know where we're going towards, is that in 24-25 this school year, our 5th graders will be taking our 5th and 8th graders actually will be taking a field test for PSSA with the new STEEL standards. So PSSA for science used to be in 4th grade. We are now this year, it is a field test. The following school year, so 25-26, the STEEL standards will be in place, and that will be the official STEEL standards test for science in those 2 grade levels. The same goes for our high school. So for this year for Keystone, our students who are taking the biology Keystone will continue to take the, I don't want to say the normal Keystone, but the standards that we have currently in place, and that will change next school year with the spring Keystone.
That was a high level overview of the achievement testing from last year. Anytime you're working with data, something like this only tells part of the story. As Dr. Ortiz shared, we are benchmarking students so that we can chart the direction they're going throughout the year and intervene if we see that more work is needed in order to get them to proficiency. We're also looking at students that are considered to be on the bubble of proficiency, which means the lowest 10% within the proficiency category, to ensure that we continue to grow them. And of course, we're focusing on students who are basic and below basic and trying to really be targeted in our intervention and support for them as well. So there's a lot going on. Sometimes scores can serve as a catalyst for a sense of urgency. And I think that that's the positive part of reports like this. There's always room to grow. There's always room to improve. And we have a fine team with us this evening that's well invested in continuing to move us forward.
All right. Thank you to our presenters, Ms. Brennan, Ms. Pouste, and Dr. Ortiz. But also thank you to all of you for representing your different schools, because it's definitely a team effort. We certainly have a ton of data here. There's always more. But based on what we have in front of us, I would like to invite the members of the committee first to see if there are any questions. Yeah, Mr. Warschauer.
First, I just want to thank you. This is like a really robust presentation. I'm sure it took a while to prepare. And I appreciate just the ownership of results, both the positive ones and the ones where there's room for growth. In one of your slides, I think it's towards the end, it mentioned school-based data teams. And this isn't as much of a question as it is encouragement, I suppose. Somebody with, I think I have some empathy for the work that you do. But thinking about the individual student approach, when I think about some of your subgroups, and I'm seeing numbers like 43 students, 62 students, I would just very much encourage, there is certainly something to be said for the programmatic approach of lifting all boats. And with the numbers that we do have, I really do think school-based data teams could do a lot in terms of working with those students. Thanks.
Mr. Helton.
So I'll echo what Mr. Warschauer just shared. Really, thank you so much. This is a lot of data, and so thank you for pulling it all together. Also, I want to recognize our principals as well. Thank you for being here this evening as well. You make it all happen, so thank you for being here. If I'm thinking about headlines, there's a lot of good news, right? I mean, we're looking at data compared, how the district's doing compared to the state, the nation, the world. There's a lot of really positives in here that we should be proud of, and so I just want to recognize that as well, because I'm going to ask a different question about an area that I'm curious about. Even though we're still performing, I think, at a higher level versus sort of the state average, Dr. Ortiz, you said early on there's sort of a story behind the data. When it comes to math, we see that decline from 3rd to 8th grade, and it's, we're not unique in Upper Dublin with that decline, but could you share what is the story behind that decline from 3rd to 8th grade? What's happening there?
I mean, I think it could be a number of things. And I think one of the things, first of all, is that programmatically, the district, prior to my time here, decided that we needed to go in a different direction programmatically. And that's why illustrative math has entered in. So I think that's part of it. I think part of that school engagement, part of that rigor, relevance, and relationships work that we spoke about initially at the beginning of the year is an area where we can continue to go down that road to improve that. Overall, when it comes to engagement and things that are really difficult like math, it's not uncommon to see, as the content gets more challenging, to see some shifts in how students are achieving. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I appreciate that, Ms. Drennan. I guess the only other piece I would add is that over recent years, there have been a number of different structural changes at different buildings and things that the intent was to help support it, but as we make new changes and implement new practices, sometimes that inconsistency can slow down the progress at times. And so we're really excited about where we are now, taking a holistic look at math to be really intentional about our actions moving forward. So that's the only other piece that I would add to it.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And to be clear, we're doing, I think, well as we look at, Upper Dublin compared to the state. And so it's just when you see numbers that start really high and start declining, you wonder, well, what's going on there? And so I think, it's going to take some time for the illustrative math to sort of take hold and for the students to move through the program. It'll be interesting to look over time what happens to those numbers. So thank you.
All right, any other questions? Ms. Inetti, grab the microphone. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, for the accommodations that a student with an IEP might need, is that dictated by the test or by the IEP team? Like, some of the tests say like SAT, they're like, you can have extra time. That's the only accommodation. Is that what we're seeing in all these tests? Is that, I don't know if anybody
Students can only receive accommodations on these tests that they receive as a part of their IEP throughout the school year.
Okay. So they could, like if they need breaks and stuff like that, for these tests.
As long as it is used during the course of their regular instruction, then it's accessible to them.
Thank you. And my other question is, do we have a significant number of students opting out? I know at one point in our history we did. I don't know if students are still doing that.
Yeah, we do have the numbers on that. If they aren't readily available, we can provide them to you after this meeting, but we did pull those numbers. We'll send them along. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
But I have a few, sorry. First, I have a couple of requests in terms of the presentation of the data, and I really like data, and I like the way it was presented, but I have kind of some other breakouts that I think might be helpful, at least to me, if not others on the board. So the individual pie charts for each grade I think are really helpful, but I think it would be great to see one chart that kind of compares them year to year, because I found myself flipping back and forth to see how did 3 compare to 4 to compare to 5. So just, kind of across all of them, that would be helpful. I think I heard earlier, is it correct, we don't yet have the comparison data because we have the statewide data, but we don't have like peer district data yet, is that correct?
Correct. What is currently posted is the 2023 results.
Got it, okay. Obviously that would be helpful, but we don't have it yet. I do also think it might be helpful to see by school as well, right? This is, and obviously that's just at the elementary level. And although I don't think it's not appropriate to show in a meeting, I do wonder, are we looking at results behind the scenes by teacher, for example, seeing where there may be opportunities to provide more supports if we see any kind of particular trend. And then I think just again, in terms of presentation of the data, and then I have some other questions, is it possible to show us a view that kind of follows the cohorts as they progress through grades, right? So you're showing me a snapshot of here's in this calendar year or this school year how 3rd did, 4th did, et cetera. But I would love to see for the 8th grade kids, for example, how did they do going back to 3rd grade, right? So, kind of follow one, set of children through.
And that's a good point. So this data shows the end of the year comparison year over year. So it's different groups of kids. And so I can tell you in our analysis of cohort versus non-cohort students, meaning students who've been in Upper Dublin for multiple years compared to students who join us at some time along that journey, the Upper Dublin students in that peer cohort out-achieve their non-cohort peers. There is also analysis available that we've been looking at that tracks students 3rd to 4th to 5th to 6th, and I think that's what you're referencing. So yes, that is also a report that we've looked at.
Yep, that's exactly what I was getting at. Okay. So then I have some just more substantive questions. Ms. Ionetti touched on the participation rates. Are we worried at all about, the participation rates kind of skewing the data? Is there any kind of benchmark about once you get below a certain level, it's, clearly once the lower the participation rate, I would imagine the less reliable it is. But is there any sort of cutoff, and are we above or below that? Do we know?
The state expectation is that you will meet a 95% participation rate, and I believe the only building that didn't meet that was Sandy Run. Subsequently, students who are outside of that 5% allowable non-participant rate are then included in your scores of non-proficiency. So yes, in some aspects it does impact the overall view of a school's performance. With that said, that's kind of why we didn't parse out different buildings, or we didn't, kind of disaggregate it more to a more granular level because of things like that.
Question about the Keystone data. I think if I remember correctly, students do need either a proficient or advanced for it to kind of count toward the graduation requirement. So what are we doing to help? Because it was, I think, particularly in math, if memory serves, it was, I think, more than half did not actually meet that standard. So I know there are other ways, there's other paths, but I'm just worried about making sure we're helping kids achieve those and recognize that they're out there, because our goal is to get everybody to graduate.
So it's an interesting question. So when the Keystone requirement first came in, it was required that you had to pass these exams in order to graduate. Since Act 158 has expanded and there are multiple pathways through, it is no longer the case that you have to be proficient. And quite honestly, that may have an impact in the perception as a student as to their approach to these exams. Clearly, we urge all students to do their best. Upper Dublin, as a whole, however, has relatively few retesters. And so when the PA Future Ready data comes out, that's the best score that any student has gotten, and it's reported out in the 11th grade year, with the idea that you would have opportunities to retest as you went through. We don't have a lot of students who take advantage of that opportunity to retest. So, yes and no, in that once you've taken it, if you are not going to retest, it's hard to continue to go back because you've left that course. You may have succeeded very well in your course here, but not on the exam. Something like math is unique in that you will have students who move on to Algebra 2. Some of those concepts will come back. You'll have an opportunity to reinforce those. But in something like biology, then you're off to chemistry and something else. So it's a mixed response, I guess, to your question.
Yeah, and the question's really just a concern to make sure for those students who, did not kind of check the box via the Keystone exam itself. Yeah, I'm aware there are other paths, but just making sure that we're supporting them and making sure they know what those other paths are, and that's really more my concern. So, is it possible to get, for the breakouts by race, socioeconomic, et cetera, is it possible to get state comparison data for those breakouts as well? Because I'm going to be candid, some of those were pretty disturbing to me, and I'm just curious where we kind of rank in comparison to other, to the state, and then obviously when the data is available, kind of our sister districts, as we call them, right, our peers. And the last set of questions I have, and I'm sorry, I have so many questions, on interventions. How many of the interventions are directed, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, in terms of adjusting our practices going forward for the benefit of students who are coming up, versus what I'm also concerned about, which is helping these students, right, pick up that gap. And, what are we doing in particular to address, right, some of those cohorts by race, et cetera. So yeah, it's kind of, clearly there's got to be two aspects to it, right? One is, how can we make practices better so that hopefully students achieve better in general coming up? But yeah, I am also very concerned about the kids who actually took these tests and their progression.
Sure. I think that's one thing that we're looking at this year overall is, what does intervention mean and how is it delivered in different buildings, whether it be an elementary school, a middle school, or a high school. We do have reading specialists. We have a math specialist now. We have instructional coaches that go in and help teachers when they want to adjust their instructional practice to meet the needs of their own students. Things like illustrative math come with built-in differentiation and exploration, which is helpful as well. But your question about globally shrinking gaps for kids, because most kids have at least one gap somewhere, right, is something we're looking at through universal screening and through intervention tools. And I think that as we go through that journey and identification of what we might want to pursue, I think that has the power to be really influential in that pathway for kids through this.
One more, I promise that's it. Can you, I think Ms. Boustet, you were talking about this, the math learning walks that you were, what is that?
It's a great question. So a math learning walk is really for the administrators. So say, for example, we're going to Sandy Run and we will take the administrators from Sandy Run, the teaching and learning team. If we're at the elementary level, we involve the coaches as well, and we go to various different grade level math classrooms. And what we have is a learning walk tool that we're really looking for student-centered practices. So we're looking for very specific things to help us as administrators and as coaches, whatever role we might be in, to really help direct the instruction that's in the classroom. So, and I don't have it pulled up, but for example, we want to see that we are making math learning visible. So how is the teacher really taking what the students are saying and making that math talk, that math learning visible? So we're trying to note those different things to kind of see the direction we need to move forward with math to provide that help and support.
Great. Other questions? Ms. Redding?
Thank you. I'll echo. It's great to see you all here as well. Jen took most of the questions, but I still do have a few. She's like, I'm going to get all my questions in. It's okay. So when you look at it overall, I have a couple of questions. One, I'll start with the AP. Is there data around how many Black African American students is that broken out by race so that we can see who's actually leaning into these AP courses? I'd be curious around that. I'm also curious around how many, once we break it out by race, can we also break it out by of those races who have IEPs, who are social economic, so we can kind of see the data by race as well to see in what ways are we repeating that data over and over again? And then my final question, which I do want some direction to, as we think about the disparity that we see, I look at it and I say, well, some subsets are doing really well in our structure and system, and there is an obvious gap of students who are struggling. And those are Black African American students, our special ed students, and our students who are social and economically disadvantaged. So I wonder, when we look at the action steps, what action steps specifically lean into supporting those subsets?
So we actually just had a meeting today with the University of Delaware, who's going to help us with that journey. So looking at the core curriculum and ways to make that relevant to students and work not with a different tool to do that, but to immerse students in the curricular material that is on grade level, which is very important, and then being able to provide supports for them that will allow them to access them. So an example today was to really lean into vocabulary and have the vocabulary that's going to be needed to understand that academic vocabulary related to the lesson be clear for all students. And so if we focus in on the language universally, it's there's a correlation between that and achievement. And so sometimes when people explain vocabulary, it's not explicit enough, even though it's implicit in the program. So how are we going to move forward providing picture clues, context clues, examples as a regular practice so that it's more accessible and understandable for all? That was kind of the cornerstone of like the beginnings of what to do next. So University of Delaware is going to come in for a visit and look, and that is intended to reach populations for whom things like language tend to be a barrier. And I think we'll see growth from that.
Ms. Jones, can I just add one additional piece to that? We recently at a leadership network meeting, we had some really good professional development with our leadership teams around the state's newly developed culturally relevant and sustaining education competencies that not only touches on race, but also all aspects of culture and folks' sense of identity. And I think that there are some clear trends that are apparent to all of us, that some of our students aren't as connected or as engaged, and that we need to be proactive in reaching out to them to bridge those gaps. And so the work that we already began with our leadership team across the districts and at the buildings, we're going to continue to develop that with our leadership team, and then also quickly begin to implement that with our staff as well. And so we're hoping that that would create, no pun intended, a sustainable approach and begin to see some headway there along those lines too.
One other thing that comes to mind is I'm also curious around how many students are, when we're looking at elementary, starting in elementary and go through 8th grade with us, and then also how many students are coming in at the middle school level. Have they been through our elementary program? Because you just see the difference between, and the gap just keeps getting wider and wider. So I'm also curious as to, when we look at the data points, did certain students come, when did they start their education with UD as well? So I think overall, really great job. It's when we have the data, we're able to create plans, lean in to where we need to lean into. So I think it's really impactful to see it and to have something to measure our growth and progress against as well.
All right, Mr. Wallach.
When you bat ninth, most of your questions are gone, so this gets easier. I echo all the kudos and thank yous to everybody in the room who participated in all this and provided it. On the science, one of the broader overall slides said that proficiency was increasing over time. When we say proficiency in that context, we just mean proficient and not advanced. Am I correct in that? Oh, it's proficient and advanced. Okay. Okay. I have to go back and look at the slide. I'll do it on my own time because that one just confused me in terms of what we were saying was increasing, but I'll look at that. Appreciate that. And then to Ms. Redding's comment about sort of more detail on the AP data, I don't know if it would provide any insights, but I'd be curious if we're going to break it down in various ways, as she said. Should we also look at it by topic or genre of exam? And it might be so small a subset that there's not a lot of correlations from, for example, math up to AP math exams, but I'd just be curious, like, sort of where the numbers fall there. So.
All right. Dr. Thomas?
I needed a little more time to process everything. It was very substantial, everything that was presented, and it's a lot to wrap your brain around. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the action steps that were presented as well. I was just curious about a couple things. Has there been any work done yet to see if the kids who are coming out as basic or below basic, if they're the kids that would be expected to be performing that way based on their course grades, or if it's different kids that maybe have test taking struggles or things along that lines? So that was my first question.
In terms of test taking struggles, I can't say that we've looked at that necessarily, but we did look at benchmark data from last year to see if it appeared to be consistent with where students landed. And in some cases, kids exceeded our expectation. In other time, for other students, they met it, and for some, they didn't reach what we anticipated they would reach. So it'll be interesting over the next few years to continue to monitor benchmark data along the way and see. We recently shifted to Linkit benchmarks. It's highly correlated, so it's really interesting actually to go in and see, how those data points play out, and that is something we're looking at.
I was also curious for the kids on the bubble or the kids in basic or below basic, if there's any extra support targeted at the transition points from 5th to 6th and then from 8th to 9th.
I can speak to each teacher is able to receive a report on their class each time they take a benchmark that compares. It includes information on their prior PSSA history and then their current benchmarking projections. And so the initial response is that at the classroom level, teachers are aware of students who are in that situation that you described and responding to that data to ensure that they either stay at that level of achievement or continue to grow at a faster rate to put them in potentially a different category when it comes to the assessment.
Final question was just around, I know that there's a lot of test question practice that happens and kind of gearing the kids up and getting them excited to take the test and telling them to try their best. I wonder if there's any more general work done on just test taking strategies, study skills, kind of broader skills that will serve kids across the board.
So what I can speak to is when we talk about our common assessments, especially in the area of mathematics, we are definitely trying to incorporate over the course of the school year questions that will replicate some of the questions that they would see on a PSSA, ones that address standards, but maybe are written in a way that is getting them more familiar with what they're going to see on that test. So that's definitely incorporated into our assessments. I would have to check back on, specific test-taking strategies and things and ways that we're doing that in the classroom, but we definitely are incorporating those types of questions and items into things that we're doing in our classrooms.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Another thing in response to that is you may recall that Governor Shapiro mandated that all testing will be online next year. And so we're cognizant of that and working through having students be familiar with taking assessments online so that won't be a new experience for them.
All right, thank you so much. Most of my questions were already asked, so it's good. Yes, the cohort data, I think that's going to be really quite interesting. And then the comparison to our peer groups. I think also the idea that, we're testing up to 8th grade, and then we still have a number of years to address certain things. But I was really curious to hear, what is being done at this point to help, especially in math area, where we see our biggest declines, and I mean, to be honest, some numbers that I just don't think we can be comfortable with. What is being done to help those students, help those teachers, and really, make that look, make those numbers and make, ultimately the achievement stronger.
So you guys can jump in here too. The math is complex in that there are a lot of potentially contributing factors, and that all needs to be unpacked in order to properly respond to your question. The curricular alignment is one thing that I think initially we need to look at. We have a new resource that gives us the opportunity to go back, make sure it's aligned to the standards and that the standards are being taught with intentionality. That's one thing. When you get to the middle level, there is a lot going on there because you have about a third of the kids who are what's considered double accelerated and taking algebra in 7th grade, and then you have another almost the rest of the population, barring a few who take it in ninth grade, taking it in eighth grade. At both of those levels, they're being tested on both the PSSA and the Keystone. And the content they're learning is aligned to the Keystone course. So all of that content that lives in a PSSA for seventh grade is not aligning with the content that's expected for Keystone for algebra. And so if students are going through that pathway, the content that should be grade level rich needs to be taught somewhere. And sometimes that then pushes it to sixth grade. And then you have kids who are taking exams 1 year, 2 years later. So the proximal time of instruction to assessment is far, it's spaced out too far for them necessarily to shine on the PSSA exam if they're in the Keystone course. There are also requisite skills that are taught in that 6th, 7th, and 8th grade year for PSSA that then help them to get through algebra that might not be firmly in place because they've accelerated through so quickly that some of that isn't being caught. Like, these are the kinds of things that we're starting to ask questions about and digging deeper into. The other thing comes with instructional practice. So we're doing walkthroughs so that we can see what the environments look like, work with teachers to figure out how they can continue to engage students so that they are a part of their learning, which is really important in math. And so as we're gaining opportunities to give people feedback, working with the University of Delaware to grow our practices, that's super important as well. But we have both curricular alignment, programmatic things, instructional, and oh, by the way, a brand new tool. And sometimes when you have a brand new tool, there is an implementation dip and it's not always a quick fix, but the long-term investment is worth it because if you do the work up front, you will then reap the benefits on the other end.
And just to briefly add on to that, I think that the implementation of a new program, I think, is really important to note. Fact that now this year our elementary school programming is aligned to the middle school programming. We're hoping to reap some good benefits from that, where in previous years there were two different approaches to mathematics instruction that were happening. One approach happening at the elementary level, a different approach to math instruction happening at the middle school level. And now that those two things are aligned, we are hoping to see some benefits there. And I'm also curious, and it was noted on one of the slides, to see what are the math interventionists at one elementary school, right? What are the impacts of that position? Is that something that we are seeing some good rewards on, and is that potentially something that can be expanded if we are seeing some benefits from that? So there is a lot happening. I think that there are explanations for much of it, not excuses, but explanations as to how we got here. And I think that that's an important part of a data analysis exercise like this, is just to try and figure out where are we, how did we get here, and then potential moving forward, how can we improve. But I think those two programmatic and staffing pieces, I think, are really important to note when looking at math specifically.
Yeah, thank you. And I think when we're looking at slide 75 with the action steps, the overview, I know there's a new team in town, but this is not something that we haven't done before. I mean, there is curriculum mapping has been happening prior to. So my question, I think, is what of these approaches are truly new, and what of it is we're tweaking to make it better or more effective?
Okay, well, let's start at the top. So the approach to school-based data teams, what will be new will be the protocol that's being used with consistency across buildings. In terms of looking at alternative data sets, benchmarking. The benchmarks that are currently in place are relatively new. We will continue to use them and get better at interpreting them. In terms of perceptual data, additional data is being gathered about students and their perception of the learning environment, which will, every time it's given, should be a new experience that we take into consideration. In terms of AP potential and PVAS projection data, they come in. So when you talk about the demographics of students that are accessing AP programming, the Pennsylvania Value Added Assessment System gives us information about which kids are likely to score a 3 or above on APs. That's an important context for counselors and teachers to know and see, so that kids who might be reluctant to enroll in that AP exam, you can then give them a push to say, we believe you can do this. And that should invite a variety of students to the table if they are not already participating. The walkthroughs for math are new, correct? So that's a new thing. The Tier 1 audit of what currently exists for MTSS is intentional. The audit part will be new. The outcomes will either be a recognition that what's in place is working and needs to continue, or it will lead us down a new path to enhance our intervention and support practices and hopefully increase safety nets for all students. In terms of curricular work, curriculum mapping, yes, that has been something that has been done in the past. What we're asking teachers to do now is to go back in and reflect on the maps that exist, because some have not been addressed in a number of years. Check alignment, but go into it with an eye towards rigor. And so we use the Bell Daggett model to define rigor for our secondary staff and think about shifting the responsibility of the work involved in learning to the student and to release part of that from the teacher. The alignment between regular education and special education, I think over time that's grown a bit too far apart and needs to be brought together. So is the concept that regular education and special education work together new? No. But I think for us, it's going to have a new definition and kind of a new approach after, we're able to kind of go in. A lot of this is taking questioning, needs assessment, this team, including, like, everybody is intentionally in the room tonight because we're all coming together to ask questions about our practices, and we see our kids. We know that there are students, whether it's to the student, to Stu's point, or to a demographic group, we know there are students that need more from us, and we're trying how to figure out how to do that for them, but we see them. And it's important to us. So it's important that you know that that is very much a part of our conversations.
Great, thank you. That was super helpful. Two more smaller questions. One is, when we break it in our different programs, there is overlap between some of those programs, right? So clearly some of the data that is in one group is counted or represented again in the other group. And that is something I think we really need to keep in mind, that it's not distinct groups where there is no overlap. So there are probably some kids or some students who fit in multiple groups, and helping those will make each of those charts look better if that's a way to represent that. All right, and then at the AP section, I just wanted to check if my understanding of that is right, is that there has been an effort to encourage more students to take the APs, and I think the data is bearing out that is really happening. One question I had, are all students who are enrolling into the AP course also taking the exam? I know many years ago there was a big drop-off difference between the numbers of students enrolled and actually taking the exam. Is that still the case, or is that more normalized, that basically if you take the course, you take the exam?
The exam is optional to students. They do not have to take the exam as a part of their participation in the course. And so what I would say to that is it's really encouraging that even given the choice or optionality of taking the exam, our numbers continue to increase.
Yeah, no, and I think that is one of the really the signs of encouragement or encouraging things, that I think more students are enrolling and more students are taking the exam and feeling and seeing success in those exams. So that's definitely I hope that line will continue to go up, and yeah, I think this is a work in progress, right? I mean, we're really looking at ultimately what students are we graduating from the district, and there may be fluctuations over the years, but in the end we want that end product to be as good as it can be, and yeah, that's why we're all here, I think. And this data and this is really helpful. I think having the peer districts comparisons and the cohorts, how they go through, will be a really helpful other part. But really appreciate having this solid presentation, and also look forward to that continued in a similar form, so we can really compare and see growth and changes over the years. So with that, I think
if you don't mind, Mrs. Shapiro, just a few comments. First, I would like to thank the team that put everything together. This was weeks and weeks of time and sifting through what was the right data to show you this first time. So I do appreciate the efforts of everybody, and of course to our team for being here. I would also like to thank the board. You had really good questions, and it's very clear there is more data to share with you, and a lot more. We could have spent 5 hours or more with you. So we took notes on some of the additional things you'd like to see, whether they're worked into future presentations or things that we share in bits and pieces throughout the rest of the years that you can see them. But there is a lot more available, and certainly we can dig deeper into that. Just one of the questions that I wanted to kind of elaborate on a little bit was yours, Ms. Redding, about, some of our subgroups and what are we specifically, or how do we assist them. I think personally one of the really critical pieces for us is one of those recommendations that you saw is the universal screener and some of the intervention tools. I think we need that universal screener to be able to drill down to see what do individual students need beyond a PSSA, and are there patterns that we then see in particular subgroups that we can then turn around and say, well, now how do we take what we just learned or pattern we saw and adjust that in our tier 1 instruction for all students so that we're hitting that within the classroom? Maybe there's not patterns, but we know what does each individual student maybe need. So that's a critical piece to me. And I also, I hope that the board, I hope you appreciate the format that we really tried to go for was to end with recommendations, so that when you see us come back in March, April, and May, and we're asking for things that might have price tags attached to them, that we will be able to point that back to tonight's presentation and say, remember the conversation about math that we had? This is something we're bringing back to you, and it's tied to that data. So we're trying to make some purposeful connections for you, and would appreciate very much your feedback as we go throughout this from here moving forward, if you see those or if there's more connections that we can make for you. But I really appreciate the time and the conversation tonight. Thank you.
All right, yeah, and I would be remiss, as we are talking about math, which is a little close to my heart, that there was a really good opportunity for families to see math in action. Was it last week? Yes, it was last week. And I want to thank everybody involved in that part to really also make that clear to families, because it's a big change. And the math that some of the parents did doesn't look exactly the same as they see their kids bring it home, and the effort that was put into that and the enthusiasm was really, really nice, both by staff but also by families. So I forgot to mention that at the beginning, so thank you for that. And with that, let's move on to our next agenda item, which are the recommendations for student activities. Ms. Brennan, is there anything that needs to be highlighted?
There are two different elementary school course, is going to Harrisburg to sing on the state steps, which is very exciting. I was asked about the difference in the cost for the bus. So there are more students going from Fort Washington requiring 2 buses. So they opted for 2 yellow school buses. And then because the group is smaller, the group from Jarretttown will be taking a charter bus. And the other item is track and field for girls at Penn State University.
Right. Any questions? Is everybody okay? Can we move that on to legislative? All right, then we'll do that. And then we have the conferences. Anything there that needs to be specified?
No, there's one item on here. I attended the Assistant Superintendents and Supervisors Summit last week in Harrisburg. It was a last minute decision to attend. They were focusing on executive functioning, which, as we're thinking about interventions, will likely play a role in how we proceed. It likely goes into the question you asked too about the drop off in students' interest or attending to a task for a while. So I decided to attend that after the board briefing had gone out and all of that. So that is a new item. And then there's one money adjustment here for someone who had something approved previously, and there has been an increase.
Any questions? Yeah, Ms. Evans.
So, sorry, I didn't think of my question fast enough back on the student activities point. So, and the singing at the Capitol is great. My son did it. It's a really, neat activity for them to do. Something you said it kind of sparked a question in my mind about, do we have guidelines about when, particularly when the district is covering the cost, we use charter buses versus school buses? Because I understand the point that, well, there's more students, so the one school decided to use school buses, but yeah, I mean, if we don't have one already.
In this case, both schools procured their own transportation and selected their own date. They just happened to be close together. To my knowledge, there wasn't conversation between them about what type of transportation they were using. And I'll have to defer to Dr. Smith on whether there's guidelines.
Yeah, I will have to look specifically at policy and if there's admin regs regarding that. So I can't speak to it necessarily here. In my experiences, it's been usually based upon the distance that you were traveling and or the availability of our own school buses to provide that transportation given the time that the transportation may be needed. But we can certainly learn more and talk to our principals to see what past practice has been.
Yeah, and just a clarification, for the Fort Washington group, there's a listing of 17 teacher chaperones versus 1 for Jarretttown. Is that correct?
That is what they put on their form and anticipate taking. There are almost 70 students going from Fort Washington. There are 17 chaperones, but only 1 substitute needed, I believe. Oh no, 17, yeah. So that's probably a difference in the cost as well.
And just looking at the dates, December 8th is a Sunday. So perhaps that has to do with the availability of school buses and why they chose a charter bus. That is the Jarretttown event. That's a Sunday, whereas the other event is on the 9th, which is a Monday.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the chaperones, the number of students is twice, and the number of chaperones goes up by 17. Is 17?
Let us learn a little bit more about that. I'll dig into that a little more.
And I take your point, Mr. Held, about it being on, if the 8th is on a Sunday, but they are asking for a substitute. So it's just something about this page is just not jiving like all over the place.
There's something not totally correct. And yeah. I'm sorry I didn't catch it before this went out. Otherwise I probably would have asked sooner. All right. So with that, before we get that clarification, I think we should then move it on to legislative. Or
We can give you that clarification
Yeah.
for the briefing so that you're prepared
Yes.
for legislative,
Okay.
yeah.
That sounds good. Thank you. And that gets us then to public participation. Anybody who wishes to address the board is welcome to come up to the microphone. Please state where you live in the district or your city of residence, or from that you're a resident or taxpayer. I'm not seeing anybody approach the microphone, and we also did not receive any written comments, so I would close public participation. And then I'd like to let you know that our next meeting will be on Wednesday, December 4th. That is following the reorg, or is that?
Yeah, I apologize. That's my
Yeah.
mistake that I didn't change that. Given the reorg and the discussions we recently had at retreat, we are not intending to have an education committee in December. We would come back together in January, but we will have policy in December. So we will make sure that that gets updated, and
Yes,
I
okay.
do have information in the briefing this week for the board.
Right, and that's what I thought was going to happen. Okay, so our next meeting, education committee meeting, will be in January of 2025, and we hope to see you all there. And with that, I'd like to adjourn. Thank you for your attention.